Thank you, Leah, and thank you all for being here. I will say that I appreciated Leah's call for all of us to breathe earlier this morning, because this is the largest group that I have presented in front of in almost 3 years. So I had to remind myself to breathe before coming up here. But when Leah asked me to come here and to give a talk, it came at a really interesting moment for me, because the theme of this conference is something that I've been reflecting on in my own work for some time. I teach a class now at Michigan State on community food systems, and what we've been doing over the last couple months is really building to this moment where we are going to begin to envision what alternatives to our current economic model of production looks like, and how it relates to agriculture. And we spent the last couple of months talking about some of the challenges that producers and folks along the supply chain face from a climate perspective. We've talked about some of the challenges of consolidation and some of the other economic challenges facing our food system. And now we're just reaching a point where we can start to think about what a more just alternative looks like. And now, in this presentation, I'm going to try to do the same thing in about 30 minutes. So we will see how well I succeed at that. But I want to start with this. And you can see this is a political cartoon sort of lampooning the idea of eternal economic growth. And the reason I wanted to start with this is because my background is as an economist. So I went to grad school, got a PhD in economics, I did my undergrad in economics, and so most of my academic journey has been steeped in this idea of economics. And I came to economics really with this idea of how can we build more equitable and sustainable economies. And when I first started in grad school, much of the focus was on, well, the question is, how can we design certain mechanisms to get firms to act in a way that's more just? How can we make it more profitable for them to do so? Sort of the standard logic that you'll often hear in policy circles in DC and other places. And then I took, just by happenstance, a class outside of my field in environmental sociology with a professor that Leah also knows and has, I think, had a great influence on both of us, Dr. Michael Bell. And we were talking one day early in this class about how, about different ideas of justice as it relates to economics, and I was sort of giving my usual spiel about how, well, if we design the right policy mechanism, we can make, these equitable actions profitable for firms, and then from there we will get to some more sustainable future. And then he pushed back with a simple question, because I was going on about how we can have equitable growth and all these other things, and if we grow the economy enough, we can distribute resources in a more equitable way. And he asked me a simple question, and that was, okay, that sounds great, but can the economy truly grow forever? And this was a question that I had never thought about. It's not something that in any econ class that I had taken over 7 years of instruction that anyone had ever asked. It was just assumed that economies grow. You listen to any of the news recently about the economy, and regardless of what party it is, they're all talking about how do we get more economic growth, right? And so there's not even a question as to whether or not economic growth is central to everything that we do. But then I actually started to think about this. Can the economy actually grow forever, right? Because, if you think about our common metrics of economic growth, it's all about GDP, right? And GDP is how much stuff you're producing, how much it's worth, so on and so forth. But to produce stuff, you need stuff, right? And if you're going to grow forever, that means you need essentially an infinite amount of stuff, an infinite amount of natural resources in order to produce over the long run an infinite amount of stuff to keep the economy growing. But unless we have some secret hidden reserve of resources that I'm not aware of, we have a finite amount of resources with which to work, which means at some point, in theory, there is some limit to economic growth. And if that's the only way that we can achieve equity, then we sort of have a problem, right? And so that simple question led me down a very different journey about thinking about what economics should look like, or does look like, or should look like. Now, when you think about how we typically teach economics. And for those of you who have taken economics before and are traumatized by this image, I apologize. But the way that we typically think about economics, right, is that you have these firms on the one hand that are producing stuff, then you have households on the other end who are buying stuff, and then those households, they work for the firms, and then you have this sort of circular motion of goods moving and money moving, right? But taking what I learned from that sociology class into this model, you realize that there are several things that just are missing. The first is that, obviously, as I've already mentioned, that we need stuff to produce stuff, right? So we need natural resources to produce goods, and we have a limit to those natural resources. So while we might think of our economy as being this independent entity separate from our planet, the answer is actually it's not, right? Our economy is very much embedded in the natural resources that we have access to on the planet. In addition, there are other elements which I came into grad school really interested in, which is the idea of where inequality and social institutions play into our economic systems. And while most economists don't talk about this, there are ways in which these outside, quote unquote, social structures, whether they be institutions that support structural racism, sexism, et cetera, have influenced how our economy has evolved over time. And so in order to really think about our economy in a way that better reflects reality, we need a paradigm that actually acknowledges that our economy is not some independent entity, but instead is embedded within our society and as well our broader ecological system. And that's where the idea of ecological economics was born. It started as this very simple critique of the way that economics is typically taught, where the economy is over here, and then you have society and the environment and all these other parts of our world over here, and trying to bring them together in a way that better reflects how our economy actually operates. And so this brings me to the work that I've done, and you're going to hear over the next several days many examples of how these principles might play out, but I'm going to focus here on some of the work that I've done to help illustrate how ecological economics looks in terms of diagnosing common challenges that we face in our food system, but as well as opening up space for imagining alternatives. Sorry, I do a lot of hand gestures as a bad habit. Lesson learned here. So when I came into grad school, one thing I was really interested in studying was food access. I grew up as an Army brat. My parents moved around a lot. My mom was a teacher, and she often taught in school districts that, for lack of a better way of putting it, were under-resourced, whether it be the east side of Cleveland, the west side of Louisville, et cetera. She taught in areas where where you had these districts that had very limited access to food, where the resources going into the schools were very limited, and so my mom often was spending lots of money out of her own pocket trying to keep her classrooms going, and often teaching students who maybe hadn't eaten the day before or hadn't eaten very much the day before. And there was an obvious connection between this sort of food insecurity and how these students were doing in school. But at the same time, the common dialogue about school performance was that, well, these students just don't care enough, right? And so to me, that just seemed very obviously not true. And so I came into grad school wanting to try to explore what these connections actually were in hopes of building a more holistic way of thinking about food access and, for instance, educational outcomes. And I remember talking to one of my graduate advisors at the time and expressing my idea of really trying to dig into what's driving food insecurity at a more structural level, and what can we do to think about how to address it. And this conversation I will almost never forget. Hopefully I'll never forget. I expressed this interest in really thinking about what drives food insecurity from a structural level, not just this idea of measuring quote-unquote food deserts and where grocery stores are located, but really what's driving that. And he told me with a very straight face, the issue is communities that don't have food access simply don't care enough to support local grocery stores, and so they don't go there. If they did, they would buy the food that was available, and then someone would see that it's profitable to locate there, and then they would. And the fact that they don't means that people just don't care enough about access to food, which that was a surprise to me because I thought everyone needed to eat. But this sort of illustrates this idea of when you think of the economy as a sort of separate institution that's not at all embedded within either social structures or environmental constraints, the sort of outcomes or the way you might address every single problem that you face, right? Everything comes down to a simple problem of supply and demand, willingness to pay, profit, etc. But outside of economics, there have been many scholars who have pointed out that this just is not true, right? And so there's this idea of food apartheid, which recognizes that where we see these gaps in food access, it's very often not the case that it's because people just don't care, but it's a result of very complex and at times intentional decisions by politicians, corporations, etc., to limit access to these essential products to certain communities. And so I, against the better judgment of my colleagues at the time, my fellow students, decided I was just going to ignore my graduate committee and decided I was going to try to explore this anyway. For anyone who's in grad school, I would not advise that you do this. But I went ahead and did it anyway. All right. And so I looked at the city of Milwaukee. I was a grad student at UW-Madison, as Leah mentioned. And Milwaukee is a very interesting city for a lot of reasons. All right. So what you're seeing here on the screen is a map which shows a redlining map from the city of Milwaukee. So for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar or need a quick refresher, redlining was a policy that was implemented in the 1930s, post-New Deal, where the government was looking to kickstart the housing market or to save the housing market after the Great Depression. And they asked the Homeowners Loan Corporation to go into major metropolitan areas and to identify what neighborhoods would be a safe investment for these federal funds to try to recover the housing market, and which neighborhoods would be maybe a less safe investment. Now, given that this was the 1930s, I'm sure that many of you can probably guess what became the sole criteria for determining which neighborhoods were a safe investment and which ones were not. Essentially, it became quite literally a exercise in how many people of color in the neighborhood. If there are a lot, then you get a red or a D grade, which means that those neighborhoods were a hazardous investment. And if your neighborhood was wealthier, whiter, then you would get an A, or you can see on the screen here, a green score, which would indicate that those neighborhoods were a safe investment. And so because of this, families that lived in these red neighborhoods, these red line neighborhoods, were locked out of those federal funds during the New Deal, which meant that home ownership rates were much lower, which for many people, given that their homes are their sole source of wealth, meant that many families were locked out of generational wealth for the next several decades. And so this is important because if we go back to this idea of retailers like grocery stores deciding where they're going to locate based on supply and demand and so on, well, if they're looking at some neighborhoods and seeing that, for instance, well, in this neighborhood, no one is able to buy a home, or the homes that are there are not very well maintained because they can't get access to refinancing to help maintain their homes, then yeah, they might choose not to locate in a neighborhood that was redlined, but it wouldn't be because, per se, the people there just don't need food. It's because they're looking at this they're looking at this sort of secondary metric of, well, look, this neighborhood was redlined, so clearly it's not a good investment for us to locate there either, even though the housing market in theory is something separate from how food works, right? So this is what I decided to dig into to see if, for instance, there was some relationship between redlining in the past and how food access looks today. And what I found was really interesting, at least to me as a nerd who really gets into the economics, right? And what I found essentially is that if you look at the city of Milwaukee today, and you look at how much it costs to live near a grocery store in a neighborhood based on the racial composition of that neighborhood, what I found was that as the households of color in a neighborhood increase, so too does the local housing costs to live in a neighborhood or to live within a half mile of a grocery store. So what this means is in these neighborhoods that, again, maybe were previously redlined and still have high levels of households of color today, if you want to live near a grocery store, you're going to have to pay upwards of $2,500 more for your home now than for someone who's living in a wider neighborhood. And to me, this pointed out two things. One, the idea that people just don't care, which was what I was told by my advisor, was wrong. And I may or may not have made a subtle dig at my committee during my defense. Again, something that I also do not advise to graduate students. When I said, as it turns out, if we look at the supply and demand model, well, the fact that prices are so much higher here means that there's actually quite a bit of demand for living near a grocery store, right? And part of this is probably because there aren't that many grocery stores in many of these neighborhoods that were previously redlined. So if you want to live near a grocery store, then you really have to compete hard, be willing to pay a lot more to live there than if you live in a neighborhood that has 10 grocery stores, where you could live anywhere and be near a grocery store, right? And so what this does is it puts people in these really difficult positions as well, though, because if you want to live near a grocery store, then you might have to give up living near the school that you want to live near, or you might have to give up living in a bigger home, or you might have to give up living near the park where you want your kids to play at. So you have to make decisions because you have to pay more to live near a grocery store than that other people simply do not. And so on the one hand, what you can see here is this idea that despite what I was told, that everything around food access has to do with how consumers prefer living near a grocery store or not, or prefer healthy food or not. Instead, there are these social institutions that were in place almost 100 years ago that shape how our markets work today. So this idea that our markets are just these independent arbiters of distributing goods just is not accurate. But the second point that I made is, on the other side of this presents a very tricky problem for how we actually address the food access question in a city like Milwaukee. Because the obvious solution in this case would be, well, again, if we go back to the traditional economic approach of supply and demand, the obvious solution would be just to introduce more grocery stores, right? You increase supply, then maybe people don't have to struggle so hard to find homes near grocery stores, and so maybe that would address the problem. And the city of Milwaukee actually tried this. I'd like to say that it was my dissertation that prompted them to do this. I'm not that arrogant to think that, although I will note it happened around these articles came out around the same time as my dissertation, so maybe. But around 2016, 2017, the city of Milwaukee, after years of hearing about the issues of food access in their city, made a very aggressive push to introduce several new grocery stores in various neighborhoods across the city. And you can see a headline here where they say outright, we've seen a lot of improvement. We're really excited about what's happening here. We think that we're addressing this food desert problem. But the problem here, and one that I pointed out when I was asked about the same question during my defense, is the problem here is that on the one hand, yes, you might see, you might improve access to food in many of these neighborhoods, but on the other hand, if, for instance, let's say a Whole Foods moves into a neighborhood that was previously redlined, the people who are living there are unlikely to be able to afford it. And the people in the Whole Foods and choosing to locate there, they're probably not thinking about the people who are living there when they're locating there. Instead, they're probably thinking, well, we can get land on the cheap. I think there's a Starbucks that's also said they're going to come here. And so this might be a neighborhood that's on the rise, so to speak. And there have been I keep doing that, sorry. There have been a number of studies that have pointed out this exact thing, that when you introduce these sort of high-end retailers like Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, Fresh Thyme, et cetera, you see housing prices start to spike very quickly, which becomes a problem because if you're living there and all of a sudden your rent goes up by 20%, or maybe your property taxes go up by 20%, all of a sudden it becomes very hard to continue to live in that neighborhood. And in the case of Milwaukee, only 5 years after that headline about improving food access, you started seeing headlines like this, where neighborhood residents who had previously been clamoring for greater food access are now saying, well, wait a minute, we got all these grocery stores and now we can't afford to live here. So what's going on? And I call this the double bind of environmental inequality, where you're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because on the one hand, you don't want to leave communities without food access, but then on the other hand, once you start to improve food access, housing prices start to rise and you run the risk of pushing people out of their homes. So then the question is, what can you do? And the problem here is that there isn't an easy answer because, again, all the things that I'm describing here are just the basic mechanics of any market, right? If we improve the quality, quote unquote, of a neighborhood by introducing a Whole Foods or the Trader Joe's or the Starbucks, then it becomes a more desirable place to live. If there's more demand for housing, then that means prices are going to go up, right? And so it's not necessarily that anyone is being evil here, although I'm sure some people have opinions about Whole Foods maybe. But for the people who are choosing to move into these neighborhoods, it's not like they're doing it maliciously, right? But this is just sort of how the economy works. But even when you try to go away from this maybe more traditional form of development in terms of thinking about bringing in grocery stores, you still see the same problem. For instance, in Detroit, over the last 15 or so years, there's been a massive rise in the urban agriculture movement there in response to the same challenges of persistent lack of access to food, dating back to redlining, and Detroit in particular has seen massive population loss due to deindustrialization, which led to even more problems. And so one of the things that local residents decided to do was, let's start farming on vacant lots. We can improve food access because grocery stores aren't going to locate here. And we can also clean up these lots that are often eyesores or places that are sites for crime and other things. And that's what you saw. You saw this massive rise in urban ag. It was a community-led movement. And so there's a lot of scholarships that's been written about the sort of emancipatory potential for urban agriculture in Detroit. But then something happened in the mid-2010s when a man named James Hance came in and said, I like what you guys are doing here, and I'm a billionaire, so here's what we can do. I'm going to come in and I'm going to buy up as much land as possible, and I'm going to build the biggest urban farm in the country, if not the world. And it's going to be a beautiful thing. I'm going to take the ideas you already have, and I'm just going to make it so much better with all the money that I have. And the city of Detroit allowed him to buy up something along the lines of like 1,500 parcels of land, which community residents have been trying to buy for years, but were locked out of because they weren't billionaires and couldn't afford to spend as much money on this land. And he not only failed to create the jobs he said he was going to create, but then in recent years, as the property value started to go up, he actually sold quite a bit of the properties to an automotive industry or automotive company to build a new auto plant. So even in this case where you have this community-led movement, it just becomes fodder, again, for the same sort of market mechanisms to lead to someone else coming and saying, well, I've got the money, let me take advantage of this in order to make more money for myself. And so this leads me to what we can do to try to challenge this problem, right? Because again, I've spent the last 20, 25 minutes here talking about, in as sort of a way, in as minimal words as I can, the problems facing environmental equity in food systems, but what can we actually do? Because oftentimes, when I say, well, on the one hand, we can't improve food access without gentrification, but we also have to improve food access somehow, people feel like they're paralyzed. Like, what can we actually do? And so, to give an example from another project that I've worked on, which illustrates where there might be some room to find an alternative, I want to talk about the University of Wisconsin Hospital. Because the University of Wisconsin Hospital, for the last 7 or 8 years, has been undergoing a very rapid transformation of their culinary services. Because starting in 2008, they started looking at health outcomes in their pediatric patients, so these are kids under 18, and they were looking at how they were doing relative to the food that they were being offered in the clinics. And they realized that despite the fact that they were a leader in pediatric care, they had kids coming in, and they were eating hot dogs and all sorts of other processed foods that were being offered on site. And a few folks got together and said, something seems off here, right? So we're this pediatric facility, we're dealing with kids who have all sorts of, really problematic diseases, and then they come here and we're just feeding them burgers and hot dogs and all sorts of other things. And so they said, what can we do to try to change this? And we did some interviews with some of the key stakeholders here and who were thinking about how they could transform their food system. And one of the first things that stuck out was they recognized that the reason why they were selling all these products to their pediatric patients, as well as to their patients in general, was because they made a lot of money, right? Kids like hot dogs, they like, cotton candy and all the other sweet things that maybe aren't great for their health. And so the reason that they were doing this was because it was profitable. But then they stepped back and said, we're a hospital. Should our primary goal be to do what's profitable? And they did a lot of soul searching, and they said, you know what? Actually, that's not what we should be in the business of doing. We should be, as a hospital, in the business of encouraging better nutrition and better eating practices. And we need to model that. And so you see here a quote from one of the leaders in transforming this food system, transforming their culinary services at UW Hospital, and they said as much. They said, we used to be focused on profit, but now we are going to transform our focus to being about health instead. And it seems like a small thing, but again, this is how pervasive this idea is that, look, the market just is what it is, there's something we can do about it, but once they stepped back and said, let's actually reshape our goals, it created the opportunity for them to think about doing a lot of different things. And one of the things they decided to do was to focus on bringing in more food from local producers, especially fresh produce and locally sourced meat, animal products that met various sustainability standards. And a telling quote here was that one of the comments they got from a producer who just happened to be at the hospital was, hey, look, we're Wisconsin, we're the dairy state, and yet you're getting all of your dairy products from Texas. What's going on here? And so as they were thinking about reshaping their goals away from just being centered around profit, another thing they thought about was, well, what does our community actually need? So they sought democratic feedback. They asked members of the community to actually give feedback about what they wanted. And what it turned out was that the community actually wanted to see more food being sourced locally. And they were willing to pay more for it because they saw the importance of supporting local producers and bringing in healthier food. So two big principles here in terms of how we can rethink economies and where ecological economics really fits in is once we acknowledge that markets don't exist in a vacuum, but instead are embedded within our social systems and our ecological systems, it gives us the ability to think more creatively about how we shape our food system, right? So you can think about bringing in more produce from local vendors if your sole concern isn't what's the most cost effective. And you can get support from the real community if you're willing to engage them in envisioning what they want their food system to look like, which you can do if your sole concern isn't what does the market dictate. Now, I don't want to paint this as a pretty story that has a fairy tale ending because they've run into some challenges, and in some cases they've realized, okay, we don't want to focus on profit, but we maybe need to worry a little bit more about cost. So if you look up this story, you'll probably see headlines like this. But the idea here is not that that UW-Madison or any other institution has figured this out entirely, but it's this idea of as we begin to complicate what we want our economies to look like, we can create this space where we can think both creatively about how we want to build our economy, but also give ourselves the grace to understand that we're not going to always figure it out, not right away. But by making our food system centered around what our communities need, as opposed to what the market dictates, it allows us to come up with more creative solutions than we may have otherwise thought possible. And the thing I want to close with, because I've only got 1 minute here, so I'm going to skip to the end, is that there was a story a couple years ago in the Washington Post that I pulled that I thought was really interesting. And it was a story about Baldwin, Florida, a small town outside of Jacksonville, Florida, that had a similar problem with food access where they only had one grocery store realized, we're not making enough money here, so we're going to leave. So you have this small town with no grocer, and what are they going to do? And there was no way to incentivize a grocery store to come into town, so what the city decided was, we're actually going to just open up our own grocery store. And because we're run by the city, we're not going to worry about making a profit. Instead, we're just going to sell at cost to make sure that folks here have food. Now, this is not exactly what you would call the most progressive city in America, but when you read some of the bullet points from the article, what you realize is that regardless of where you go, there are these underlying principles of democracy, of equity, that everyone can sort of get behind, that aren't necessarily built into our markets as they exist now, but once we begin to be more creative in thinking about how our economies can be shaped away from the dictates of the market, we can really come around to some really interesting and creative ideas. And not only that, despite what disagreements we may have, there are common principles that we can all get behind, whether it be everyone deserves to have access to food, that food should not be about profit in a vacuum, but instead about actually feeding people, right? And if we can come together on these common ideas, even if we may disagree about how to get there, and trust me, I have plenty of disagreements about how we get there with people, you create more space for collaboration than might be otherwise possible if we get stuck in these really strict, in these very rigid camps that we've found ourselves in over the last 10 or so years. And so I am running out of time, so I will leave it there, but I hope that, as to Leah's earlier point, that as we talk over the next couple of days, that we begin to allow ourselves to be creative about thinking about what our economy could look like if we just thought about our core goal as being equity and feeding people as opposed to profit. Thank you.
We'll do Q&A. We'll do Q&A now. Yeah. Thank you, Phil. Now we got a few minutes for Q&A, and just so you all know, the Q&A times are pretty short. That is because the roundtables is where we really emphasize conversations both with speakers and amongst yourselves. So thank you for your patience with us. Michael and I will be running mics around the room, and also if you see me checking my phone, it's because we're also taking questions from the virtual audience. So any questions? I see a question.
Hello, my name is, sorry about that, that's very loud. My name is Anna. I'm a young farmer myself. I'm also in planning school. Really appreciate your presentation, and I also work for the National Young Farmers Coalition. Right now, we've been looking a lot of money coming down from the Biden administration for food hubs. A lot of that money we see doesn't often go to community-based projects. That's one thing I see as a trend. Federally, you have money, billions of dollars that come down, and how does that money reach the people who need it most? So as we think of these big food system changes, how can we, both as advocates, farmers, and folks working in this food system, ensure that when there are opportunities and federal funding coming down, that they go to, community-based needs and projects?
That's a great question, and it's something that I've thought about a lot, and I've worked with food hubs regionally to sort of think about this question. And there's no great short-term solution, but I tend to try to present this in two ways. One, there's a need for institutions like Michigan State and other universities to be much more proactive in providing technical assistance to smaller community-based organizations, because oftentimes that's where the gap is, at least in the short term, is how do we build competitive proposals to make that case? And that oftentimes it's not the ideas, it's often that the larger organizations simply have grant writers on staff who are able to meet all the exact requirements that the grant is looking for, and they know what language to look for, how to write every single piece. And that's a place where universities and other public institutions, as institutions that are meant to support the public, should actually be living up to that mission. And that's something that we have a lot of talks about at Michigan State, is thinking about what our role is as an institution in terms of supporting that vision. But in the long term, there's also a need to bring this idea to the government itself, right? And so I'm thinking about representation in those spaces, because while there's been a lot of progress there, it's still often the case that you have the larger institutions that are more represented in those spaces where these policies are crafted, as opposed to more community-based organizations. And so you sort of need both, and it's not something that is a switch that can be flipped overnight, but that would be what I would say are the two big pieces.
Thank you. Any next questions? Okay. It's so nice that you're so close to me.
Hi, I'm Alex Tolan. I'm one of the New Agrarian members of the New Agrarian program. When you were talking about that we can't have infinite growth because there's no such thing as infinite resources, are there any possibilities in the economy that can grow and that can add value, but is not necessarily based on resource extraction, such as expanding care economies or expanding ways to value and incorporate land and agrarian practices into actual economic value?
Another great question, and I know we're limited on time, so I'm happy to talk about this in greater detail, but I'll give the 20-second answer now. The answer is yes and no. And so in the short term, you're not going to transition our economy from being growth-based to not growth-based overnight. That's just it's not really feasible, right? But the idea of emphasizing these service-based parts of the economy, the care economy, is a segment of the economy that can be expanded on greatly, that wouldn't necessarily require additional resource use. And so if we're thinking about a long-term transition away from a growth-centric economy to a non-growth-centric economy, the care economy is a central piece of that. Although in the long run, academically, the research is still very skeptical that you can use that as a perpetual model, right? So you're not gonna get to a point where you can infinitely grow services, because there's only so many people and those services can only go so far. But in the next 20, 30 years, which is a time frame where we need to make significant change, that is a core strategy that I think many economists outside of the mainstream are arguing needs to be made.
Thank you. And we'll take one more from our virtual audience. This comes from Julie, and I know we're running out of time, so it's a big question, but you can give the bullet points on it. I'd like to know if you see the investments in regenerative food and agriculture as something that will be accessible to lower income and redline communities. If not, why not? And how do we shape the regenerative food movement towards accessibility?
Yeah, so that is a great question, and something where I wish I had been a bit wiser with my presentation time, because that's the bit I was going to get to and I had to sort of skip past it. The short answer is it is possible, but we have to again think about what tools we have to make that possible. If we're just relying on, all right, we're going to introduce regenerative agriculture techniques or ideas in different communities and just leave it at that, then you run into the same problem that the urban farmers in Detroit or other places run into, is that what happens when someone with larger resources comes in and says, all right, I want to use this to make profit for myself, because even no matter how many resources, no matter how many techniques you may have, when you're competing with someone who's working with billions of dollars, you're always going to be out of luck there. But what the UW hospital example shows is that we can use, for instance, public institutions like hospitals, universities, even libraries, who all of which have budgets and need to buy food. You can leverage those in a way to, like, for instance, if Michigan State were to say, we're going to shift our food budget towards specifically buying food from local producers, we're going to target communities that have maybe been divested from in the past. In theory, that's something that's possible because Michigan State's a not-for-profit. The reason that they don't do that is for other reasons, but they could, in theory, do that. And so we can leverage community institutions for that purpose if we wanted to. And so that's the short answer, is that you can use these public institutions to sort of safeguard communities away from outside private interests.
Thank you. And that is all the time we have right now for Q&A. Can everyone give a round of applause for Dr. Phil Warsaw?
We are going to invite back to the stage Dr. Phil Warsaw for a slight encore to be able to go through a few more of his slides. He's going to talk for about 15 minutes.
Hello again. I'm going to go ahead and say that this is totally planned and that all the extra slides that I had were totally intentional and not just me over preparing. But
Speak closer to that or talk into
I
this
can,
one?
if I can,
Okay.
yep. But it actually, I think, is serendipitous that I come back because Dr. Gordon Nimhard just gave a really great talk about cooperatives and the history of cooperatives in the United States and their role in sort of thinking about alternative economic approaches. And part of what I was going to include in my talk before, but did not have time to, was to actually talk about how cooperatives in this current moment are seeing a resurgence in some places, and the role of cooperatives, again, in thinking about alternative economic paradigms. And so the model I want to talk about briefly, which builds on what I was talking about earlier in the KCVW hospital, is an approach called the Cleveland model, which was developed in large part by the Democracy Collaborative, which is a nonprofit in the United States. And this approach has been used both in Cleveland as well as in a few other cities, most notably in Preston, a city in the UK. And the basic idea that the Democracy Collaborative had was, when we think about economic development in the United States, oftentimes what we think about is how can we get these large businesses to locate in our city. Some of you may remember several years ago that Amazon was thinking about building a second headquarters, and they essentially had this nationwide competition where they asked cities to tell them, what are you willing to give us for us to locate in your city, right? And so you had all these cities basically tripping over themselves to say, we'll give you these tax breaks, we'll give you even more tax breaks and even more tax breaks. And ultimately, I believe they decided to locate in New York, and then they ended up switching that and ended up going into Virginia after there was some pushback. But this is the traditional way that most cities think about economic development. If we can bring in a large industry player, then that'll generate new jobs, generate wealth, et cetera. But what we've seen in cities like Seattle, which is the home of the original Amazon headquarters, is that that's not exactly how it works, right? So you create a lot of jobs, which is really great for people who maybe have a college degree and who are able to qualify for those jobs. But all that money ends up leading to prices going up for everything. Housing becomes very expensive. So then you often see a rise, in addition to this greater wealth and this job creation, rise in things like homelessness, gentrification, and other problems. So what the Democracy Collaborative suggested was, what if we took this same idea, but instead of encouraging these large corporations to come into our cities at the price of these massive tax breaks, could we not encourage local businesses to do the same thing for us, but on the condition that they actually provide development that's equitable? And thus the Cleveland model was born. And so their idea was, in a city like Cleveland, we have these hospitals, we have universities, we have libraries, we have all these institutions that have to spend a lot of money. So could we not require those institutions to buy more of their food, for instance, locally, from local producers? In addition, because for producers this would mean a guaranteed income, guaranteed business from these large institutions, the trade-off we can then make is, if you want to do business with us, then you have to meet certain sustainability requirements, certain labor requirements, so you have to pay your workers a living wage, you have to make sure you're growing your food using these certain standards, and you can think about the equivalents for other non-agriculture businesses. And in doing so, we can ensure that the business that we're doing is actually generating greater economic equality. And so in Cleveland, what they did was, oh shoot, I pushed the wrong button. All right, so what they did, so here you can see what the actual model looks like. So at the top you have these anchor institutions. So those are your hospitals, museums, things like that. These institutions that are not likely, because of their mission as well as their location, to leave, right? So Cleveland State University is not gonna all of a sudden pick up and move to, Alberta, right? Because why would they? It's Cleveland State University. So those institutions are then going to buy their products from, again, these locally sourced these local businesses, local producers, et cetera. And in particular, there are 3 businesses that were developed in part in conjunction with this model, 3 worker-owned cooperatives There's a food cooperative, Evergreen Growers, there's a solar energy cooperative, and then there's a laundry cooperative. And then these three companies, all of which are worker-owned, then are providing services for these institutions. So for the hospitals and museums, et cetera. Now these cooperatives, what they do is, as they make a profit, as they make money working for or providing services for these institutions, a portion of those profits are then saved and put into a separate fund. This fund is called the Fund for Employee Ownership. So then this ownership, this separate fund is then used to buy out other small businesses. So if you have a small business and the owner is retiring or otherwise looking to sell, this fund is then used to buy up those smaller businesses and also convert those businesses into worker-owned cooperatives, which can then provide additional services to the larger institutions, all on the conditions that they provide the same living wages, sustainable production, et cetera. And so this is just another figure of the same model. And here you can see in the middle there, those are the worker-owned cooperatives that have formed the foundation for this Cleveland model. So you have Ohio Solar, Evergreen Growers, and then Green City, which is their laundry cooperative. And this model, while it's not quite at a massive scale to this point, they have begun to use this fund for employee ownership to start expanding and buying out other businesses to convert them into worker-owned cooperatives. So this is just a map of Cleveland, and that little pocket that's highlighted there is called University Circle, and that's where you have universities like Case Western, Cleveland Public Library. So that's really been the hub for this Cleveland model that they've been developing. But recently, I think about a year ago, the Fund for Employee Ownership actually bought their first business, so the first instance of this model expanding beyond these three cooperatives. They bought out this company called the Phoenix Coffee Company, so it's something to look for whenever you're in Cleveland, and they converted this business into a worker-owned cooperative. Now, I mentioned earlier most of my talk was about what we could do if we were to move away from thinking about profit and maximizing profit as our central organizing principle. And in the case of Phoenix Coffee, what they've done is, if you look at their year of the end or end year business report, how successful they've been, et cetera, if you look through their pages, you won't really find them talking much about how much profit they've generated and how much value they've generated. Instead, you see things like how many employees are making a living wage, how many of their employees are people of color, how many people are staying in the business for multiple years. So not only are how many people are employed, but how many people are staying around for the long term. So in essence, thinking about how well is our company actually treating our workers as a central principle of this cooperative now, which is a far cry than what you might get if you were thinking about Amazon. I can't imagine Amazon putting together a page that looks like this. And if they did, I can't imagine how those statistics would look. And the idea here, again, is because they're a worker-owned cooperative as part of this Cleveland model, then, for instance, the local hospital, university will then be buying coffee from this company, giving them a guaranteed level of business, which helps them become more financially sustainable. And again, all this is organized around not just thinking about profit, but instead thinking about how well do we treat our workers, how sustainable is our production, and how much are we contributing to the local economy. And so while many of the examples that you were hearing earlier are thinking about this history of our cooperatives, it's worth noting that there are cities that are thinking about this right now. The challenge is that, again, this is one city at a fairly small scale in terms of number of businesses, but what some studies have found is that cities that have used this approach have actually seen more sustainable economic growth, so in Cleveland and Preston in particular, than in the cities that have gone down this traditional attract the businesses with the minimum taxes and all of the other sort of carrots that they use. And so I just wanted to mention this because I'm glad that I had the chance to come back out here and talk about this, because a lot of the stuff that I was mentioning maybe have seemed a bit abstract, but there are cases where there are people on the ground doing this work, and there's a lot more room to expand upon this if folks were to, one, be aware of it, and also, two, really begin to organize around it. Because the question that people in Cleveland were asking, and I think I'll sort of wrap this little encore with this. The question that folks in Cleveland were asking is, these are our tax dollars, right? We all pay taxes, we all put money into this pot. So why is it the case that we're putting all this money into our taxes, also that we can basically give that money to Amazon in the hopes that they might locate here, so that they could then lead to all of these unequal outcomes, rise in homelessness, rise in housing costs, et cetera. And then in 10 years, if they don't like the way we're doing business, they can just leave and take the money with them, right? And so the idea here is that because these are our public tax dollars, we, whether it's the citizens of Denver, the citizens of Cleveland, the citizens of whatever city, in a democratic society, you have the ability to have some say over how those dollars are spent. And whether we would rather, and the question then becomes, would we rather be spending these dollars supporting locally owned businesses, worker-owned businesses, or would we rather that money go to Amazon? And I think if you ask most people, regardless of their political affiliation, you'd have a lot more people who would support the local business model versus the Amazon approach to development. And so this is just something that I wanted to bring to your attention. This is, again, all available via the Democracy Collaborative's website. I would strongly encourage folks who are interested in this approach to take a look. They have a ton of resources, and they are very much trying to get other folks to be interested and to advocate for similar approaches in their own cities. So I'm glad I was able to share this, and hopefully this is of use to you all. And once again, I will say thank you for giving me a chance to speak.
So I was just curious for the example of the employee-owned business. How did the employees gain ownership of that? Was it purchased by the government and then distributed to those to the workers, or did they take any risk in putting their own money up for it, or how does that functionally work?
Yeah, so in the case of the Phoenix Coffee Company, it was bought out by this, so the nonprofit, I have to remember the name of it, but the nonprofit that sort of organized this entire model, they set aside funds specifically to buy out businesses that were being sold by retiring business owners, which was happening in the case of Phoenix Coffee Company. The owners were retiring, were looking to sell, so then the folks who had organized, who had put together this fund, then bought it out, and then began to transfer ownership over to the workers. So then the workers now own it, but they didn't have to put up the upfront capital to do so. And so I believe the Democracy Collaborative, through a combination of private and public funds, they started those first three cooperatives, and then the funds for the Phoenix Coffee Company were then bought by profits that were taken from those three companies as they were earning those profits. So the idea is it's a public-private sort of partnership at this point. They envision it hopefully becoming fully public down the line, but at the moment it's public-private, and the idea is if you buy in, then you're agreeing that whatever profits you have, you share some of that with this collective to help build the model up and help it become more sustainable in the long run.
Cool. Thank you. And Phil, do you have any final remarks you want to make?
No, I think I have fully shared everything I can now, and I'm looking forward to the roundtables.
Awesome. Thank you. Another round of applause for Phil.